Okay, welcome back to another exciting graphic design tutorial, computer graphics tutorial. Okay, what I want to talk about in this tutorial is Photoshop. And we haven't gotten to Photoshop yet, but we are now. And if you're watching this video, this is probably the first lecture in Photoshop you're going to hear. Photoshop and Adobe InDesign are very similar in terms of what they look like. The interface is, as you'll see, is very similar. And what we're going to do is we're going to create that brown bear poster in Photoshop. Now, at the beginning of class, I talked about how the big three software programs of Adobe, Photoshop, Illustrator, and InDesign, are all similar in a lot of aspects, but are very different in others. Illustrator's strength is drawing, Photoshop is photo manipulation, special effects, and all kind of things. And InDesign is a page layout program where you have multiple page documents and you're trying to put everything together. I usually refer to InDesign as a print application, but it's not necessarily print anymore. There are a lot of things you use InDesign for that go up on the web or just digital output, animations, interactivity. There's all kind of things that InDesign does. It's no longer just a print application. But in an instance where we're doing a poster, a single page poster, we can actually do this in any of the three software programs, those big three software programs. And so I thought I would take something that's familiar to you, something that you've built in InDesign, and now recreate that in Photoshop. And we can do, pretty much exactly the same, have the exact same outcome in Photoshop. It works a little bit different. And through this exercise, you'll see the differences and the similarities of both software. So with that, let me share my screen. And as we can see here, we're in InDesign, and this is what we built. The brown bear poster, which is basically on several layers. We created 3 layers in InDesign, a type layer, an images layer, and a background layer, and we put various elements on those layers. We didn't have to do that in InDesign. We could have built everything on a single layer, and we could have just arranged things from front to back and back to front and all of that. But it's just easier to work with layers because it allows you to kind of click and turn off things that you don't want to see. We could turn off all of our images, we can turn off our background layer, we can isolate things and see things that we want. I like working with a minimal amount of layers in InDesign just to kind of keep organized. And when you click down on these little arrows here, we didn't talk about that, you can actually see what elements are on those layers. So we can see in this type layer, we have that chunk and that chunk, okay? If we just turn off the type layer here, it turns off everything on the type layer. So we can get into each layer and we can see those things that are considered images. We have, under images, we have that dot, we have the logo, and we have the map, all in images. Okay, so that's kind of how InDesign works. You have layers, but you have, categories, and you have all of your elements within those layers. Okay, turn that back on. Okay, I'm going to jump over to Photoshop now, and I've already built this in Photoshop, but we'll build it again from scratch. And as you can see up here, you can see I'm in InDesign, and I've got Photoshop open in the background here. So let me click on that, and that will come forward. And now we can see that we're in Adobe Photoshop. Now, if we look at Photoshop and InDesign side by side, we can see that in Photoshop we have the same kind of toolbar that we see in InDesign, right? The same thing. You can see side by side here how similar these are. But they're different. There's different tools in Photoshop than there are in Illustrator. I mean in InDesign. We have a contextual menu that runs across the top, similar to InDesign. We also have panels on the right side. But this is where Photoshop gets a little bit different. If we look at InDesign, InDesign is pretty streamlined. You know, you've got your panels here, they fly out. In Photoshop, however, you have lots of things going on in here. And you can customize this. Remember in InDesign we have the Essentials Classic. Well, in Photoshop we can click this little arrow up here. I know I have these things right on top of each other. But we have different palette configurations also. Essentials, 3D, motion, painting, photography, and so forth. So we can customize these palettes based on whatever we're doing. If we're doing a lot of photography work, if I click on photography, you can see how the palette configuration changes. We have a histogram, we have things like that, and so forth. You know, if you're a painter, you can have brushes available to you, swatches, colors. Those are the things that you would need in painting. We're going to go to Essentials and get back to this. The most important part of these panels that you're going to be concerned with is really down here under Layers, Channels, and Paths. These things are grouped together, and the layers are the way Photoshop works. So you're kind of familiar with layers when you constructed that in InDesign, but Photoshop is solely dependent on layers to create things. So we have to use layers. We can't just create all of this on one layer. Every time we put something down, for the most part, we're using a separate layer. And those layers are automatically established a lot of times when you bring something in. So if I set some text, the text is automatically going to be created on a separate text layer. So if I have this set of text right here, now I could create the text on one layer, but then they move together. I can't separate one from the other. Like if I wanted to move the brown bear, the heading, independent of the copy, if they're on the same layer, both move together. So in order to move them separately, they have to be on separate layers. You can see here, this is the copy here. If I click the eyeball off, that disappears, and this is the heading up here. Okay, so you have to really wrap your head around layers when you're dealing with Photoshop. It's a layer-based program, and you're always going to be dealing with layers, and you can accumulate so many layers in Photoshop. You can see that this project alone has all of these layers in it. And it's similar to InDesign in the fact that if I had turned down these layers here, this would kind of represent all of what you're seeing here in Photoshop, all of this. You can see all the different layers. And so that's, it's kind of similar, and it looks a little bit different. You can move these layers up and down. Whatever layer is on top is always the priority, so it's always going to be on top. So you notice that this map here, if I click on it, you can see it highlighted in the layers palette, and you see that the map is above the text. So wherever I move the map, okay, it's always going to be on top of the text. Okay, there's no way for now with this layer configuration here, there's no way I can get the text on top of the map. But if I move the map, I'm going to click on the map and move this underneath the text. So now it's underneath this text. Now when I move the map, it goes underneath. It's kind of hard to see, but because it's white. Um, but it's going underneath that text. Okay, you can probably see it more with the logo. See how the logo is underneath the map? So if I click on the logo, it always goes underneath the map. If I want the logo to be above the map, I will move the map underneath the logo, and now the logo's on top of the map, and now when I move the logo, it will be on top of the map. So you can see how the layer structure works. Okay, so in this case, building this project might even be easier in Photoshop than it would be in InDesign. We can do this all in Photoshop, and since our photos came from Photoshop, it's kind of, you know, it kind of makes sense to just build everything in Photoshop. Why go to another program when we can do this all in Photoshop? We built this in InDesign because it's a 3-page document. We have 3 other documents and we want that all in one file. So that's where InDesign is, you know, a better way to do that. But if all we were dealing with was one poster, a single file, we can build that all in Photoshop. Okay, so let's get started with this and put this together, and you'll see that it comes together pretty quick. I'm going to show you some things along the way, so this, you know, this video might get a little lengthy, but you know, it's again me showing you Photoshop and some of the features. Okay, so let's start by creating a new document. And in Photoshop, we go to New, and when I click New, we see our new document. And again, we know that it's 6.5 by 9.5. Okay, same size as in InDesign, in inches. Make sure it's in inches. Only in Photoshop, we have this thing now that we have to determine, and that's resolution. What is our resolution going to be? And in this case, we're going to make it 300 pixels per inch. And when I give the lecture on resolution, you'll understand what this means. But for now, just type in, it's usually the default, 300 pixels per inch. The color mode, we can keep this at RGB, background color white. Everything else is the default, so I would just leave everything the same here. And then we're going to create the document. Okay, and that's what we look like. Now you notice the difference between Photoshop and InDesign is that we don't have all those margins, you know, it didn't ask us for margins. Because in Photoshop, this is considered a canvas. It's not considered a page necessarily. You know, Photoshop, painting, photography, it's really the canvas. So InDesign refers to this as the page, but Photoshop kind of refers to this as the canvas. Okay, now the first thing that we're going to do is this is the background layer. Okay, whenever you open up a document, you always have the background layer. So think of this as the back, you know, the page. Now we're going to color this page brown. We don't have to draw a rectangle and make a, like we did in InDesign. We're just going to color the background brown. And I already have some browns up here that we can use, but if you're establishing brown for the first time, you can double click on the, this is called the foreground color and background color. In InDesign, this is the fill and the stroke. Okay, these are just foreground or background color. If I click on the first one, it's the foreground color, and we can search around for a brown. Okay, now if we know that the CMYK mix or the RGB mix from this, in fact, if I went over to InDesign and I clicked on this brown, okay, and I double clicked, you can see that in RGB it's 119, 90, 60. Okay, red 119, green 90, blue 60. And I can actually come into Photoshop and just type that in, okay, and 119, 90, 60. So let's do that. 119, 90, 60. And that gives us that brown right there. I'm going to click OK. And you notice my foreground color fills with that brown. And to fill a with the foreground color, to fill with this color here in the foreground, the command is Option and Delete on your keyboard, the main keyboard. Okay, Option, Delete. So you hold Option down, then Delete, and that fills the background or fills a layer with that background color. Okay, so that's easy enough. And now we're going to make that inner circle. Okay, and before we make the inner circle, we're going to add a layer. So we're going to add another layer right here. Down at the bottom, you have the plus layer icon, so we're going to add a layer. And I'm going to just double click on this and call this the inner circle. Or the inner circle, the inner rectangle. Okay, and just so I know what it is. Okay, now the way you draw a shape in Photoshop, in InDesign we took the rectangle tool, right, and we drew the rectangle. In Photoshop we're going to take this tool up here, the second tool from the top. It's the rectangle marquee tool. So I'm going to click that rectangle marquee tool. I'm just going to eyeball this and start up around here. Click and drag. Okay, and we can always modify the shape. But I'm going to click and drag to somewhere around there. And now I'm going to fill it. Okay, so I have to fill it with a color. So in fact, let's go back to InDesign and let's see what this color was. Okay, this brown color here. I'm going to double click on that. And that was 665022 RGB, 665022. So I'll come over here, 665022, and type that in. 66 tab 50 tab 22. Okay, and that gives us that dark brown. I'll click OK, and that fills our foreground color up here. And to fill it, okay, I do Option Delete, and that fills with that foreground color. Okay. Well, I have to target the layer. Option Delete. Okay, so there is the yeah, you have to target the layer to do anything to it. Okay, if the layer isn't targeted, nothing's targeted, whatever you do doesn't work. Okay, now to get rid of the outline, or what we call the marching ants, we call them marching ants because they kind of move like marching ants around the edge of selections. We just do Command D for deselect. Okay, Command D for deselect, and that deselects that. So basically what we have is a background and an inner circle, and when I click on the background, you can see that that's what is selected. When I click on the inner circle or the inner rectangle, you can see that it highlights that. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to bring in the bear. Okay, I'm going to deselect all my layers here, and we're going to bring in that bear. Well, we know that bear, you have that in your thaw space. You have that bear, you brought it into InDesign. We're going to do the same thing. We're just going to click and drag and bring it into Photoshop and let go. Now, the bear comes in. Now remember in InDesign, we clicked and we dragged it and we had to draw a box for the bear to come out, or we clicked once and the bear came out. In Photoshop, it just automatically comes out, and notice how it made a new layer for us. Okay, we didn't have to make that new layer, it just automatically makes the layer. First thing I'm going to do is type bear photo and label this. Okay, bear photo. It's pretty obvious, but that's what it is. Okay, inner circle or inner rectangle, you can see it highlighted. Click on the bear image is highlighted, layer is highlighted. When I click, I can just move it, and I'm going to move it down here. Now to enlarge a image in Photoshop, you do Command T for transform. Okay, Command T. In InDesign, you already have these boxes. Whenever you click on something, you already get these boxes, but in Photoshop, you have to transform. So you do Command T. The boxes come out, the box comes out, the handles are here. Now remember in InDesign, in order to scale something up, we had to hold the Command and the Shift key. In Photoshop, you don't have to do anything. You just grab the corner and it automatically proportions it up. You cannot, uh, you know, make this, out of proportion. It just automatically forces you to enlarge it proportionally. So I'm going to enlarge this bear, let's say maybe about there. And then to get rid of this bounding box in Photoshop, you just hit your return key. Okay. So we have our layer of our bear, we have our inner rectangle and our background. So now all we have to do is bring in the map and the logo. Let's do that. So we'll come over to our assets folder, and I'm just going to grab the map and lay that in. Now it comes in actual size, so I'm just going to grab the corner and reduce it down. See, in Photoshop is really easy. No modifier keys or anything. You just kind of grab that and make it smaller. And then I'll come over here and I'll grab the Yellowstone logo and I'll bring that in. Oops, I have to deselect that. Okay, and then bring in this logo here, drop that down, make this smaller, move this over here, maybe make it a little bit smaller. Okay, hit the return key, set that. Okay, and because it's named Yellowstone logo, Yellowstone map, when I clicked and dragged it in, it already gave it that name. Okay. The bear photo came in at something weird, bear KO2. I don't know why I didn't bring that in, but I had to name the bear photo. Okay, so we have these two things, and now all we have to do is set the text. Okay, so setting text in Photoshop is pretty simple. There's a couple ways we can do it. One is, now we have to use the text tool. One is by just grabbing the text tool and clicking. Just click once. And whenever you click, it actually sets a word for you. Like if I looked here, you can see, oops, zoom in here. Okay. There is a word that it's set here somewhere. Let me delete that. Okay. I tell you what, let me do this all over again. Okay. We grab the text tool. Okay. Right now it's set to be minion regular. Okay. And the problem is that the color default is set to the same brown as this brown. So that's what happened. When I clicked, it set the text, but because the color was the same color as this background, it disappeared. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll change the foreground fill here to something like, let me just change it to white. I'll just go up here to white. Okay, so now whenever I click, it's going to set Minion Pro Regular 8 point in white. But I want to set this in chunk 5. So I'm going to go chunk 5. I'll just set this up in chunk 5. And let's get this up bigger. So let's say maybe 18 points or so for now. And then I'm just going to click once. And you can see it sets the word. And this just throws out a word just so that you have something here and you can start typing. So I'm going to start typing let me highlight this. Yeah. Oops. There it is. The brown bears, next line, of Yellowstone. Okay, in chunk 5, 18 point. Okay, now we know it's going to be bigger. So I'm going to get on my move tool. This is kind of like the selection tool in InDesign. And I'm just going to kind of move this over to about there. Notice how it made a text layer for me. This layer shouldn't be here. To get rid of a layer, just click on the layer and hit the trash can down here. Okay, that'll get rid of the layer. Sometimes when you use text, if you start clicking too much, every time you click, it makes a separate layer for you. So all I want is one layer right now, the brown bears of Yellowstone. So there it is. Okay. With this layer selected, I want to enlarge this. I want to bring it up in size. So I'm going to do Command T to transform. Okay, I'm going to grab the corner. I don't have to hold any modifier keys down. Click and just kind of drag this visually up till it's about that size that I want. Okay, and then I'll just kind of center this and move it over and then hit my return key. Now, if you want to close up the leading, which needs to happen, the space between baseline and baseline, I'm going to get my text tool, highlight this, and I'm going to come over here to my palette configuration. And you can see if you're on properties, you can see that you have these leading controls. Right now it's on auto. And or I can click in here, this little strip right here where it says A. That brings out my character palette, and I have leading here. So you notice you have it here and here. Okay. In InDesign, remember it was up here. Okay. And I can decrease my leading to a specific point size. Okay. Now if I don't know what point size I want, remember in InDesign we have, when we get on the text tool in InDesign, let me flip over to InDesign here. Okay. Remember in InDesign, when we want to go down in point size, we have these arrows up and down. Okay. And we can go down in 1 point increments. Well, in Photoshop, we don't have that. If I highlight this text, I don't have those up and down arrows. I have to know what the leading number is. Now, if I don't know what the leading number is, here's a little trick. You can just click in there, okay, in the leading field, either here or over here if you want to use that. Okay, I'm going to use that because, you know, I don't need the fly out menu. And then if you hold your command key down and use your down arrow, okay, or up arrow, oh, I'm sorry, your down arrow, and keep clicking. Notice how that second line starts tightening up, okay? You're starting to reduce the leading here. Notice how it's 30 points, right? 20, 31, 32. See how I increase it with the up arrow? I decrease it with the down arrow, okay? And that's fine, okay? So command and either up arrow or down arrow. All right, so that's done. And now let's throw in that block of text, the body copy. Okay, we're going to get on our text tool again, and I'm going to change this now to Minion Pro, and I'm going to make it small, say Minion Pro Regular, make it 8 points in white. And now, oh, I know what happened. Because my text layer was selected, I started changing my heading that I just said. So let me Command Z that back. Okay. All right. I actually, what I want to do is okay, we'll do it this way. I'll get on my text tool. I know it's chunk 5, 34 points. That's going to be way too big. But let's draw a text box here. Okay, and see how it's set chunk 5. And I don't want chunk 5, so with this highlighted, with this text highlighted, I'm going to go up here and change this to Minion Pro. Let me go down to Minion Pro, okay, and make this 8 points. Okay. And it's got a lot more text here that it said, so let me just highlight everything again and do Minion Pro. Not Myriad Pro, but Minion Pro. 8 points. And the leading is going to be over auto. So I'll make it auto. Okay, and that's what that should look like. Let's make sure that that's all auto. And 8 point. There. Okay. Now remember in InDesign we did fill with placeholder text. Well, we don't have that feature in Photoshop. So when you click a text box, it fills it with placeholder text, but a lot of times it might not give you enough depending on the size of your text box. So in that case, what I'm going to do is I have my text tool. I'm going to click in my text box. You see how my text box is way down here. I'm going to make that text box about here. And then I'm going to just highlight this and copy it, Command C, and then click right here for an insertion point, and then do Command V, and just lay in some more text. This little plus sign means that there's more text to be seen. Okay, so that's okay. That's fine. Let me move this up and kind of line it up against this, flush against this heading. That position looks good. Let me grab my map and stick that there. You notice how that magenta arrow tells me that I'm aligned with the S of bears. Okay. And I might even make this map a little bit smaller. So I select the map. Notice how it selects that map layer. Command T to transform. And I might just kind of transform this a little bit smaller. Okay, hit my return key. Grab my Yellowstone logo, stick it right there. Okay, maybe grab the brown bear and nudge it down. I'm selecting the text and I'm using my down arrow key. And you can see it coming down ever so slightly. Okay, and that is done. Now all I need to do is do that red circle right there and reduce the opacity. Okay, so I'm going to create a new layer. So I'm going to go down here, create a new layer, and I'm going to call this layer red dot. Okay, that's the red dot here. I'm on this layer, I've targeted this layer, and I'm going to draw that with the ellipse, or not the rectangular marquee, but the elliptical marquee. Okay, think of that as the circle tool in InDesign. Okay, let me zoom in to this. So I'm going to do spacebar and command. Again, that's the same shortcut key that allows you to get to your zoom tool. And I'm just going to stick it right where I want to draw that and kind of click and zoom into that exact spot right there. Okay, right in here. And I'm going to hold the shift key down and I'm going to draw a circle. Okay, somewhere around like that. Okay, now I need to fill it with red. So I'm going to go up to my swatches, and you should have red as a default in your swatches palette here. I'm going to click red and watch what happens over here, the foreground color fill. Okay, when I click on that, you see how it fills it with the foreground color. And how do you fill an object? Command or Option delete. Option and then delete. And it fills it with whatever color is your foreground color. So you need to change your foreground color first and then fill it. So if I wanted it green, I would select green there, and then I would do Option delete, and that fills with green. But I'll go back to red, Option delete, fills with red. Okay, now how do you control opacity in Photoshop? Well, here is your red dot layer. And remember up in InDesign, it was up here. We controlled opacity up here. Well, in Photoshop, what we do is we select the layer, and right above that, you see opacity right there. And I'm going to select that and slide that slider down to about, oh, somewhere around there, 40%, 50%, something like that. So anywhere where we can see through that. Okay, so that's done. And to get rid of the marching ants, I deselect, which is Command D. Okay, and that deselects. To back out, it's the same thing as in InDesign, Command 0, and that gets me to fit in page. And basically what I've done now is I've created the exact same document. Here's the one in InDesign. Here's the one in Photoshop. Okay, InDesign, Photoshop. And you know, now one of the things that might look a little bit different, and if we pull this up side by side, let me just kind of minimize the InDesign version so that we can see it side by side with the Photoshop version. Make this a little bit smaller. Okay. Let's pull that down. Command 0. Okay. So here we are side by side. And you can see that, well, honestly, it looks pretty much the same. You might see some color variation between the two programs, Photoshop and InDesign, even though we use the exact same RGB mix for these colors. But for the most part, it's pretty much the same. So this just goes to show that we can create the same document in both applications just as easy. Actually, I kind of like Photoshop a little bit better to create these. But now if I had to do the elk poster and then the bald eagle poster, in Photoshop I would have to create a separate file. And I'd have to create 3 separate files for each poster. Whereas in InDesign, I could create one file with 3 pages, and they're all contained in one file. Now, we talked about packaging, and we talked about moving a file from InDesign to another computer, and we had to go through this process of packaging, which packaged up all of our photos and all of our type fonts and all of that. In Photoshop, you can just take the Photoshop file. Like when we save this, okay, now let's go through the save process and then we'll be done. I'm going to save this now, this Photoshop file. Let me just clear out of this. The way we go about it is we want to save kind of 2 things. In InDesign, we saved our InDesign file, and then we exported a JPEG, okay, a separate JPEG. In Photoshop, we're going to save our Photoshop file, and then we're going to save a JPEG. In Photoshop, it's save a copy. In InDesign, it's export. 2 different ways of doing the same thing, and that is saving out a JPEG, but saving the original document, native document. So if I go, notice how this is untitled, we haven't saved yet. So if I go to File and Save, I'm going to save to my computer. The default is the Photoshop format, and that's what we want to do. The first save is going to be to save the Photoshop file because we want to preserve all of these layers. We want it to save these layers in case we have to open this up again and make modifications, make changes. Let's say we spelled something wrong. Okay. If you save as a JPEG, then it's baked in. You can't go back and open up. You can open it up in Photoshop, but you can't go back into the type layer and change, the layer and correct your mistake. Okay, so we've got to save this as layers. So you can see that I'm going to save this as brown poster as a PSD or Photoshop document. I'll save this to the desktop just for the sake of it, so that you can see it. So I save and save. Okay, so there is my PSD file. Now if I transferred this to a flash drive, everything is contained. All the photos, the map, the Yellowstone logo is all baked into that file. Okay, so I don't have to package anything. What I do have to do though, however, is if I used any fonts in this that are not in my system or in the computer that you're moving it to, you have to grab those fonts. And you're going to have to manually grab the fonts because Photoshop does not have an automatic font packaging system. So you're going to have to go into your font book, drag out the fonts that you used, and put them in a folder. And that way, if you took it home to your computer, a PC or computer in the library or whatever, you're able to load those fonts. So it's recognized. Now we did use Chunk 5, which is a specific font that most Macs don't have and most PCs probably don't have. And we also use Minion Pro. And Minion Pro is native to a Mac. So if you opened it up on a Mac, it should be there. But on a PC, I don't know if Minion is an actual font. That's standard on a PC. Okay, so you do have to grab fonts, but you don't have to grab images and graphics and anything else that normally, InDesign packaging feature would find for you. Okay, now we want to create a JPEG, not just the PSD. Let's say we want to upload this to Canvas for an assignment. So now, once this is saved as a PSD file, we can go back up. Now we do have export here, okay, and there is a quick export that you can do to export as a PNG. We can do that. You can upload PNGs to Canvas if you want. This is a very fast way of creating a PNG, but let's say we had to create a JPEG, a specific file format, JPEG. And JPEGs are universally recognized amongst just about every platform that exists. In that case, we would have to save a copy. Okay, so we'll go to Save a Copy, and we'll keep it the same name, but instead of PSD, we're going to come down here, just like in InDesign when we exported, right? We're going to find JPEG, and we're going to notice how it changed to JPG. Okay, it's no longer PSD. And I'll save this again to the desktop, and we'll save. Okay, and I'll save it at the maximum JPEG quality, which is that. And there is my JPEG. Okay, so here's my original Photoshop file, and here is my JPEG. Okay, now if I open the JPEG up in Photoshop, we wouldn't see all of these layers. Okay, watch. When I drag this to the Photoshop icon and open this up as a JPEG, okay, you see how it just comes in as a background layer? I can't change the type. I can't move anything around. Okay, I can't do anything because this is one solid file. But if I open up the PSD file, then I have all my layers and I can go ahead and make modifications. Okay. So that's how you create this document in this poster in Photoshop. And we're going to be talking more about Photoshop in the recent or in the next few the upcoming week or weeks. We're going to be talking about I'm going to go over a more kind of complete interface tour of Photoshop. But the best way again to learn software is by actually doing something. And because you're familiar with this project in InDesign, I thought we can create this in Photoshop, and now you can get a little taste of how Photoshop is different and similar to InDesign. Okay, much more to come on this. Let me stop sharing my screen here, and I'll post this video so that you can practice with this and get a feel on how to do this. And I suggest that you do this. I don't know if I'm going to make this an actual graded assignment, but I want you to try and do this in Photoshop as well. Okay, with that, I'll see you guys in class.